Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the show. It's been a couple of days since we got to the NFL headlines. And in this episode, I will be going through a lot of the biggest free agency news. I have a number of questions preloaded that I'm going to be answering as we go along. And of course, with this being a live stream Q&A, you can jump into live chat, leave your questions. We'll be good to get to a variety of different topics, a lot going on, a lot of noise across the league. I don't have any monumental takes in terms of forward-looking projections and how things are going to go, but I have already run through a wave of win totals. I have updated some of those win totals. I've seen adjustments. I sent it out in the footballbetters.com newsletter last week with the initial rundown, and some of those numbers have definitely changed. I think some of those are going to continue to change as we see other quarterbacks find spots. The draft obviously comes through and teams build up the rosters a little bit more. But in terms of the last, we'll call it 5 to 6 days, I would say I've seen more moves and more excitement than I thought we were initially going to get from what looked like a bit of a dud free agency class. I wouldn't say anybody has drastically shifted their chances of contending per se. I think some teams have really improved in key spots. Some have done so in a very wise manner, some not so much. I'll get to those teams as well and talk about them. My first kind of just comment and takeaway here is last year I really got into the draft for the first time, and this year I have started things earlier than I ever have. And my big takeaway from the draft last year and just going through the handicapping process and doing a lot of things with it that I did not do in years was just how many of the beat writers and the reporters and the reliance on them and how messy things became as reactions became more prevalent. There were more discussions about it. We're pretty out of control. And I was amazed by how many swings in the market came from that. My free agency takeaway is not that. My free agency takeaway in being this dialed in with things going on was the initial wave of reactions was everybody rushing to try to get the right take out first and then reference that they were first with the take. But what I've seen now in the last, I would call it 12 to 18 hours, everybody's had a bit of a chance to exhale. And I've seen a lot of really smart commentary come out about why some of the initial wave of reactions were right or why they were wrong. And I think now as we get kind of 24 hours plus removed from the initial wave and the hype and the excitement, there's a lot more clarity coming in about what's going on. And so that will continue to adjust numbers a little bit as well. So I see a handful of people joining in the live stream. Good to have you guys with me. And leave your questions in the comments and I will get to them as we go. I'll bring up the first question that we have. And that is, which team quietly pulled off one of the smartest free agency hauls of the offseason so far? My answer to this is the Denver Broncos. They took some low-risk chances with 3 players specifically, which I think could have significant upside. We'll start on the defense first. The 2 names that they acquired were Hufanga and Greenlaw from the San Francisco 49ers. Now, both of these guys had injury-riddled 2024 seasons. Hufanga played 308 snaps. Greenlaw played less than 40. Why this matters and can potentially have such a big impact for the Denver Broncos in this upcoming season is if either of these guys are able to return not all the way, let's call it 75% of the way to what they were as players in 2023. This is a huge win with both guys for the Denver Broncos defense. Now, Denver last year was number 1 in EPA per play allowed on defense. They were number 3 in scoring defense for points allowed. This is already a stacked defense. The 2 big issues that they had were a linebacker that could cover sideline to sideline. And Dre Greenlaw in 2023, when he was healthy, was one of the best sideline to sideline linebacker defenders in coverage in the entire league. In terms of passes expected thrown his way, he was number 1 at preventing them. He was so good in coverage when healthy. And then Hufanga is dynamic, both against the run and against the pass, can do both. And you think about the weaknesses of the Denver Broncos defense, it was in both of these areas. And so the Broncos go out with a stacked defense already. And they say, we're going to add these 2 veterans. They get relatively good deals for them. And if these work out, is this going to be better than the 2015 no-fly zone Broncos defense? I think it's in the discussion. I mean, this is a stacked and loaded defense that just added 2 weapons, potentially that if, again, they get back close to that 2023 form, my goodness, you think about this division and how competitive it's going to be. The Broncos just gave themselves a big competitive advantage if these turn out. Now, the similarly bigger news today that came out was they signed Evan Ingram, who was let go by the Jacksonville Jags. I think this is significant because last year the Broncos had zero tight end contribution in that offense. It is a spot that Sean Payton, throughout his entire coaching career, has really valued. And it's been like a year and a half now where he's been pushing to get that joker guy. He had Taysom Hill with the Saints. He's been searching for that answer in the Denver Broncos offense. When you think about what Evan Ingram can do in the tight end position, out wide, perhaps he gets creative and uses him elsewhere, gets him involved in the backfield. I think this is, again, another really savvy, low risk, high upside, high reward signing that the Denver Broncos were able to make work that is really exciting to think about. I mean, the Broncos last year surprised everyone league-wide, myself included. This time last year, I was talking about the Denver Broncos as a bottom 5 team in the NFL. That was the consensus. There was no expectations for this team at all. Really overachieved. They've got the rookie quarterback. They're able to spend elsewhere. And the way that that defense progressed, my goodness. And so I think quietly, because the Broncos are not necessarily, from my viewpoint, on my timeline, on the shows that I'm watching, being discussed as the big winner of the free agency window, when we're putting this question to test and saying which team quietly pulled off one of the smartest hauls, I think those 3 signings for the Denver Broncos were absolutely terrific. And so I give the Denver Broncos the answer to this question. Check in with the comments. Ryan Roberts saying, good evening. Ryan Roberts, you're finding the shows everywhere we go. Good to have you back for another show as well. Big Ross saying Hufanga was a shell of himself last year, probably the weakest link in that 49ers secondary when he played. And this is the point, Big Ross. Like, he came off a serious injury, but then he dealt with the ankle injury. He dealt with the wrist injury. He tried to play through both of those. I agree with you. He was not himself at all last year. The question is, does he get back to 2023 with a full offseason and potentially a healthy season coming up, playing in that defense that complements what he does very well? I think there's certainly potential that he could. Again, that's kind of where I'm seeing him stand out. But you're right that he didn't look himself at all last year, and obviously Greenlaw didn't in the very limited snaps that he was able to play. We'll stick with the 49ers for this question. Which team made the most drastic shift in philosophy based on their free agency moves? And I would say that it is, in fact, the San Francisco 49ers. It is a very divisive team. There was an Adam Schefter tweet that went out yesterday, and he listed the laundry list of guys that departed the 49ers that were there last year that will not be there this year. And I scrolled through some of the comments just to kind of see, like, what's the sentiment of this move? How is it being gauged overall, just in general by fans? And on like the 3rd or 4th comment, there was a poll and it said, will the 49ers make the postseason in 2025? And it was like 78% people voted no, they will not make the playoffs in 2025. I don't agree with that. And I think the moves that are being made by San Francisco so far in this offseason are being viewed in a bigger negative light than they should be, because around the San Francisco 49ers, I feel like there is a sentimental evaluation of some of these players. And so driving from White Rock to Saskatoon, a 20-hour drive, it was longer than that, making stops with the dogs. I listened to a lot of podcasts, and this was now a couple weeks removed. So we weren't in the combine hype. We weren't in the free agency hype. And there were a lot of conversations about what the 49ers are going to do this season. And whether it was NFL Daily with Greg Rosenthal, whether it was the Athletic NFL podcast, whether it was specific 49ers ones, a question that came up multiple times was putting guys on the show on the spot and saying, how many guys do you think are still there from the last Super Bowl run compared to 2 Super Bowls ago? And guys were answering 12 guys, 15 guys, 20 guys, and the number was like 5 or 6. And so it kind of struck me as unique, because we think about, and certainly I do, the San Francisco 49ers as this team that has had this coaching staff and all of these 49er guys on the team for like every season during this run. And the reality is that that just isn't the case. And this team has actually had a lot of turnover. And so I think there's that like feeling in the back of a lot of fans' minds that it's like, well, shit, they're getting rid of the entire team. I mean, everybody's gone from the 49ers. And I see this differently. I see these moves being made not necessarily as a negative, but as a necessary change. And I'll start on the offensive side of the football first. In the 2023 season Super Bowl against the Kansas City Chiefs, Steve Spagnuolo effectively set the blueprint for how to defend the 49ers. He played man coverage 70% of snaps. It was a ridiculous rate of cover 0, a ridiculous rate of cover 1. And it was something that the 49ers really struggled with earlier in the season against the Cleveland Browns. It was Brock Purdy's worst game against Cleveland. He followed that up with the Chiefs game where he faced the same amount of coverages, the same surprises. It caught him off guard and the offense struggled. Post-game, through the offseason, Kyle Shanahan was talking about that game specifically. You can find quotes on it. He was like, that's the best defense we played. We didn't have an answer for it. George Kittle said similar things. And all season long in 2024, we saw teams who, for years against Kyle Shanahan, would not dare play man coverage at a significant rate. All of a sudden, turn that dial way up. And we saw over the course of the 2024 season, defenses play man coverage against the San Francisco 49ers at the highest rate for a season-long number in the entire Kyle Shanahan tenure. And it was about 10% higher than the previous high season. And so defenses in a copycat league took what they saw the Chiefs do in the Super Bowl, took what they saw the Cleveland Browns do earlier in the regular season, said, here's the answer for how we defend the 49ers. They cluttered up the middle of the field. They stopped blitzing. They stopped bringing extra pressure. They dropped guys into coverage. They said, we can contend with your receivers out wide. And when you don't have Christian McCaffrey on the field, we're not scared of these guys running downfield. Our DBs can stick with it. And these crossing patterns and the way that you target the middle of the field, that's not a problem for us. It's not a threat. And it really switched, and teams just kept piling on and on and on. Now, I'll put a caveat to this and say, look, when the 49ers last year were the most injured offense of any team, that's not helping anybody. But this reminds me a lot of Sean McVay coming out of the 2019 Super Bowl against Belichick, where Belichick copied what Fangio did earlier in the season. And it damn near drove Sean McVay to retirement because he had to rethink the entire offensive scheme. And so the common takeaway on X right now is that, man, you're cutting Kyle Juszczyk. That's a culture killer in the locker room. He's a day one guy. How do you move on from him? Well, he played 50% of snaps. I mean, at best, you're saying he's a role player. He was a mismatch guy in this offense. I get his impact, but losing him is a necessity as the 49ers are going to be shifting this season from a team that played 21 personnel with 2 running backs and 1 tight end at the highest rate in the league, 35% of snaps. They're going to be shifting into playing 1 running back, 2 tight ends, 12 personnel, probably at a similarly high rate. They played 12 personnel last year at the lowest rate of any team in the league. And so that fullback position in this change of necessity for Shanahan is going away. You don't need him. Deebo Samuel, another guy, has been there forever. This culture guy in the locker room. How in the world could you ever get rid of him? He's one of the worst route runners against man coverage in all of football. If Shanahan is switching this offense by necessity to go more 12 personnel to take advantage of the way that teams are now defending him, Deebo Samuel is going to be more of a burden than he is going to be a benefit in what Shanahan, I believe, is going to want to run more of in the upcoming season. And so these departures, I don't view as a big negative on the offensive side. I think it's a needed change. And one other thing that I'll throw in here before I'm going to address the obvious question, which probably is coming up in the comments, I haven't looked yet, but I also think about how necessary this change is for the 49ers going into this season with Mike Macdonald hiring Clint Kubiak in Seattle. Clint Kubiak is a direct disciple of Kyle Shanahan, worked with him in San Francisco, knows this scheme because Kyle Shanahan learned it from Clint Kubiak's dad. And now Shanahan has promoted the other Cliff Kubiak, son of the Kubiak coaching tree, on his staff. But now with Clint being in the division on another team with Mike Macdonald, who, if you remember back to 2023, embarrassed Shanahan, and his defensive scheme has been renowned for busting up this Shanahan scheme and causing all these different ways to look at defending this. Those two guys now on Seattle get to practice with each other every single day. I have to think that there's going to be evolutions in Mike Macdonald's defense, which got better today, by the way, getting to practice against this scheme every single day and evolve and get better. If I'm putting myself in Kyle Shanahan's position, I'm saying, look, those two guys are only going to get better at defending what I do best. The league is now coming at me in a different way. I've got to make changes. I've got to start doing things differently. And if he's going to adopt what guys in the college level are doing against these spread defenses, which he's seeing a ton of, which the NFL is going to, the answer there is 2 tight end sets with the 1 running back. And so I look at San Francisco as a very intriguing offense that is definitely changing their philosophy. And I'll leave it with this and say, if they draft Tyler Warren, who all of these draft comps are comparing to being effectively another George Kittle on the other side, very physical and blocking, a good route runner. You think about what Shanahan can drop with both of those guys, and then you have Jennings and Pearsall to start the season. Ayuk, who's awesome against man coverage, coming back at some point unless he's traded, with McCaffrey in the backfield if he's healthy. That's a scary offense to have to go against with a lot of lack of knowledge league-wide about what it's going to look like on the field. And so this is viewed as a big negative. I'm not there yet. It's going to be a big philosophy change, but it's one that kind of excites me a little bit as well. Big Ross says a healthy CMC makes it a lot tougher to play man. This is exactly it. He is that matchup advantage beater, because if you're going to sell out over the middle of the field and try to take away those routes and dedicate more guys to take on tight ends, then he's out of the backfield, an easy option to get to. If you're going to dedicate some of those personnel to taking away McCaffrey coming out of the backfield, well, then those tight ends are going to be wide open. But the fact is, if these defenses are going to continue to play man and continue to go smaller and drop more guys in coverage, you need advantages. And the 49ers didn't have that last season. And so, again, I want to not gloss over the fact that they need to get a lot of cap space cleared for a Purdy deal. That's inevitable. They also were the most injured offense last year, but there's still this year to be played and this year to work things out. And so that's why I think we're seeing the difference here being made. Next question up is, which team spent big in free agency but still has major holes heading into the draft? My answer to this would be the New England Patriots. I think what they did on defense is admirable, and I like the 4 major moves that they made. Adding Milton Williams on the defensive line was probably the highest rated defensive prospect on anyone you want to look at's board or ranking list. However you want to describe it, he was number 2 in PFF grade for interior defensive linemen last year. I think about what happens if Christian Barmore is able to come back and he's hopefully healthy enough to play. The duo of those two rushing from the interior, where do you rank that duo? I think it's certainly top 5. So the upside from that is massive. Additions of Harold Landry and Robert Spillane maybe go a little bit under the radar in the sense of them not being widespread household names. But something that stood out to me as I was reading through some of the moves and the commentary that came from it, both of these guys were top 10 on their respective teams last year defending the run. New England really struggled defending the run last year at times, and it was a way that we saw teams consistently move the football on them. If both of those guys get their play elevated because they're working with Mike Vrabel, who played the position as great run stoppers, there's a lot of potential there for what that looks like and how much that could improve the middle of that Patriots defense. In the back half, you have Carlton Davis added, who was the number 7 cornerback last year against man coverage in terms of passer rating allowed. He is going to be opposite Christian Gonzalez, who got isolated and picked on a little bit last year because there was just nobody else in the backfield to help him. Christian Gonzalez, early on in his career, is talked about by other players in the league as being one of the best matchup shutdown man corners in the entire NFL. So if the Patriots are going to go with a man-heavy approach on the back end, they've got 2 of the better cornerbacks in the league to do it. So if everything comes together for this Pats defense, not only is the floor going to be higher because Mike Vrabel is coaching and it's not Gerard Mayo, which is going to elevate what the downside is here at a minimum, but if you have all of a sudden a top 5 interior pass rushing duo, you have 2 top 10 guys against the run, You have 2 top 10 man corners. This defense that finished 30th last year is going to improve significantly in 2025. Do they get back to 8th like they were in the final year that Bill Belichick, the greatest defensive coach of all time, was coaching? Probably not, but it's going to be a defense that's average or above, I think is a fair estimate to give them. And you match that up against the 5th easiest schedule of opposing offenses with 6 or 7 teams that don't even have a quarterback settled at this moment as we're talking in early March. I think this is a Pats team that can suffocate opponents with their defense and be competitive and just hope their offense does enough. Now, when I say still has major holes heading into the draft, the big miss by New England was they didn't address anything on offense. I know they add Morgan Moses. That's not enough. They didn't go after any of the big wide receiver targets. They may still get Cooper Kupp, who I think performed better than I thought and felt like he did last year in an injury-impacted season. But with Cooper Kupp, it's a question of injuries and how much you're going to get from him if he's put in the number 1 wide receiver role. The Rams elected not to build their offense around him and go with Puka Nacua and let Kupp go. How telling is that the franchise that built who he is was willing to part with him? Is he capable at this point in his career of being a true number 1 and giving you a full season? I think that's a lofty expectation. The Patriots in the draft, picking wide receivers, have not had any success at the position through their evaluation and their picks since Julian Edelman in 2009. You have to go back a long way. And between then and now is a laundry list of names that failed. And so there is an issue in terms of how the Pats evaluate and draft wide receivers. And so hoping that they're able to fix that going into the draft, I think is another lofty expectation on this team to figure out and get right. So a big defensive improvement for New England, but the offense still has a ton of holes, and the offensive line is still a liability. And you have a second-year quarterback in Drake May, whose growth might be stunted from that, having, I would say, the worst set of playmakers around him of any team in the NFL. Now, the footballbetters.com newsletter fired the editor this morning as there was a comment made that Drake May was still a rookie. Obviously, still not a rookie, but I'm calling myself up for that and letting that one slide in the editing process. And so if anybody was reading the newsletter and you were getting ready with the angry email coming back, I saw the mistake and I sent it, and I was reading. I sent like 4 or 5 test emails. I'm not going to lie. And I'm reading through them. I'm like, this is great. I sent it and I read back on my phone. As soon as I read it, I said, oh my God, what did I do? And so silly mistake in the newsletter for those of you who read it. Which teams' free agency moves reveal that they don't actually believe in their quarterback? Easy answer to this one is the Indianapolis Colts. Anthony Richardson was drafted by them number 4 overall a couple seasons ago. He has not turned into the quarterback that the team anticipated happening. What do they do to support him and build around him? Well, they do the complete opposite. And Chris Ballard at the Combine is saying, we're going to have wide open quarterback competition. Now, when he said that, and I was watching those comments, my thought was, okay, they're going old veteran quarterback. Maybe it's Aaron Rodgers. Maybe it's Kirk Cousins. They're going to follow the path that they did with Phillip Rivers or Matt Ryan or Joe Flacco, which 2 of the 3 had pretty good success coming in and working with Shane Steichen. Certainly Phillip Rivers, the best of the 3. I thought that was the path they're going to go. No, they go and they sign Daniel Jones. Number 6 pick a couple seasons ago, let go by Brian Daboll and the New York Giants, let go by Kevin O'Connell and the Minnesota Vikings. And now he is going to compete with Anthony Richardson for the starting job this year for the Indianapolis Colts. The obvious problem with this is that these 2 quarterbacks rank last and second last the last 2 seasons for passer rating. You have 2 very bad quarterbacks competing for the starting job in Indianapolis, a team that desperately needs a quarterback. That's the obvious problem here. The maybe not so obvious problem here is that I think doing this in the manner that Indianapolis has is not going to get the most out of either quarterback. So Anthony Richardson is working with Josh Allen, and he's working with Josh Allen's trainer to try and improve his accuracy. I remember back Josh Allen, year 1 to year 2 to year 3, a big criticism I and everybody had about him, and I certainly sent some bad tweets about it that I regret now. The MVP ticket last year made me feel a bit better about it, but quarterbacks just don't take these big leaps in accuracy ever. And Josh Allen really was a big outlier. Jalen Hurts, to a lesser extent, was a bit of an outlier in that regard and being able to improve season over season in a big way. The floor for Anthony Richardson to become more accurate couldn't be lower. His completion percentage below 50%. I mean, it's not going to take a lot to improve it with the arm talent and strength that he has. But by having this split competition, when repetitions are so important, when you have to split an entire offseason and what will likely be splitting an entire preseason, you're going to be costing your quarterback some valuable reps in that process. And I don't know if the Colts come out on the other side of this with any answer at quarterback. I think they just end up realizing both of the guys are not a fit for this offensive scheme. And so not only is this a sign of lack of belief in their quarterback, Anthony Richardson, I think you can point to the benching of him last year and how that was handled as another sign of lack of belief. But I think this ends up failing both quarterbacks and doesn't get an answer for the Indianapolis Colts. Ben Solak of ESPN a couple weeks ago wrote a really good article about the resurgence of bounce back of quarterbacks moving on from their first team. And he had a criteria, and he broke down, here's why Sam Darnold had revived success. Here's why Geno Smith had revived success. Here's why Ryan Tannehill had revived success, and kind of broke it down. Daniel Jones was referenced in the article, and part of the criticism was the second team he went to with a very good offensive head coach and a very good evaluator of quarterbacks elected to let him go. The second problem was a lot of the throws that were being made by these other quarterbacks in other teams were never being made by Daniel Jones to begin with. And another thing that didn't work in Daniel Jones' favor was in New York, he was working with an elite wide receiver. And so when you think about Darnold or Tannehill or Geno Smith in their first stops before finding these resurgent seasons, they were playing with a supporting cast that was horrendous. And Daniel Jones, throughout his time in New York, either had one of the better wide receivers in the NFL or one of the better running backs behind him and couldn't make it work with either, and then went to Minnesota and he got passed on. And the last criteria that doesn't really work in Daniel Jones' favor was either teams or coaching staffs for these other quarterbacks that found success with another team were viewed as really poor organizations. The Jets, the Panthers, the Giants certainly fit that criteria, but to see him slip through Minnesota, who does things the right way and is able to get so much out of their talent, I think is pretty damning for Daniel Jones and any chance of a bounce back and a comeback. And so the Indianapolis Colts move at the quarterback position specifically shows they do not believe in their quarterback. Now, the last note on the Colts that I would say is defensively, with Lou Anarumo coming in, he got Bynum, who's going to be his Jesse Bates. They added on a couple other pieces. I think all the defensive moves for Indy were actually really good. And the defense is going to improve relative to what it was last year for Gus Bradley. The problem is the offense can only get so far for another season without a competent option at quarterback. What's one signing we will look back on as a disaster? Seattle signing Sam Darnold is where I'm going to go with this. I believe that Sam Darnold last year in Minnesota, as we referenced that article that Solak wrote, we referenced what happened for Darnold. It was a career year. I think it was a byproduct of the team situation and scenario that he was put into, rather than this being a full career resurgence for Sam Darnold going forward that can be applicable in Seattle. I think we're very unlikely to see Darnold reach that level again with the Seahawks this season. Last year in Minnesota, Sam Darnold threw for 4,300 yards, 35 touchdowns, 12 picks. Amazing season. Was legitimately in MVP discussions at one point last year, was illegitimately in comeback player of the award discussions almost the entire year, not eligible, even though people wanted to try and make him eligible. he had an awesome season. But I think, I don't want to exaggerate, 35 quarterbacks would have had, by definition, an awesome season playing in a dome with a massive home field advantage, playing with Justin Jefferson catching passes from you, playing with Jordan Addison catching passes from you, playing with TJ Hawkinson catching passes from you, playing with Aaron Jones in the backfield, and most importantly, playing with Kevin O'Connell, developing a scheme around you to make life incredibly easy for you as a quarterback. And by the way, playing opposite that Vikings defense with Brian Flores, that doesn't hurt either, putting you consistently in comfortable positions. And so to me, that entire platform and what the Vikings deliver to a quarterback just puts the floor dramatically higher than what you're going to get from 26 to 27 other teams across the entire NFL. I think it's an outlier, and I think it was for a reason. I think about the differences in Darnold going from Minnesota into Seattle. Well, he's not going to be playing indoors in a dome where everything's comfortable and controlled. He's not going to have DK Metcalf as a weapon. He's not going to have Tyler Lockett as a weapon. He's going to have Jackson Smith and Jigba, who, even though he put up number one numbers last year, is going to be playing wide receiver number one in an offense for the first time in his career. He's going to be throwing to Marquez Valdez-Scantling, who was added as well earlier today. That's a big difference in terms of caliber of weapons. He is going to be playing behind an offensive line in Seattle that is a lot worse than the offensive line in Minnesota. Now, at the start of the show, I talked about how we're getting to the point now where the initial hype and reactions have settled. When I look at season-long rankings from Ben Baldwin, who puts together offensive line aggregate rankings, the season-long numbers and the difference in offensive line between Minnesota, who finished 12th, and Seattle, who finished 26th, is incredibly wide. What stood out as a little bit different was when you look at the second half of the season specifically, you see that the offensive lines performed at about the same level of play. And so there is some noise in those season-long numbers, but I think it's absolutely true that Sam Darnold is going into a worse offensive line position in Seattle than what he was playing behind in Minnesota. So not only is the scheme going to be less effective than what he had, the weapons are going to be less effective, the offensive line is going to be less effective. I think it's a problem for Darnold going into Seattle. Now, what I want to say to kind of round this out and be fair to Darnold coming in, Clint Kubiak as an offensive play caller in this scheme asks very little of his quarterback at the line of scrimmage. Very seldom is the quarterback asked to change protections. When you hear Derek Carr talk about it, when you hear past quarterbacks talk about it, they always reference being able to play fast and being able to play free at the line of scrimmage. Sam Darnold needs this. So from a fit in what's being asked of him perspective, Kubiak makes a lot of sense for having him there. I think that that's a good mesh. The big question for me is, will the line be able to hold up? Because last year, no quarterback in the NFL had more quick pressures against him, which were pressures from defenses in under 2.5 seconds, than Geno Smith. And Geno Smith was able to navigate the pocket and just make the one or two moves to extend the play enough to make a play. He was a magician at doing that. He did it so well. That is not what Sam Darnold does at all. Sam Darnold holds on to the ball. He needs to play in rhythm. He needs to play in structure. And he was very good at completing those deep downfield passes, but so many of those were schemed wide open for him in great pockets with great protection. I don't know if those are going to be there again for the Seahawks as much as Kubiak is going to try and as much as he was able to do that in the New Orleans Saints with a bad offensive line scenario as well. I think that's asking a lot. And I think that the price they paid for Darnold and the downside he brings and the fact that, again, Minnesota was able to move on from him effectively with a 2-game sample size at the end of the season where pressure overwhelmed him. I think there's more downside in this deal than not, and we could look back at this March 12th, 2026, sitting here and say that was a big whiff by the Seahawks, who wasted probably what will be the number 2 defense in the NFL, the way that is trending. Did any teams make moves that signal they're in win now mode? Yes, the Las Vegas Raiders. I think it's by it's not by choice, it's by necessity as well. Pete Carroll's going to be 74 years old this season. Geno Smith, who we just talked about, is going to be 35. The Raiders don't have a lot of time to rebuild. If they need 3-4 seasons, is Pete going to be coaching into his 80s? Is Geno going to be the quarterback into his 40s? I mean, there's no time to rebuild in Las Vegas. And so the fact that the Raiders went out and got Geno Smith as a big surprise, I think, is the biggest signal that of these teams in free agency, the Raiders were the one team I think I was unsure about that said, hey, we're here and we're wanting to compete and try to win now. How does Geno Smith fit in with the Las Vegas Raiders? Well, as I mentioned, he was a magician at navigating the pocket last year for Seattle and just extending the play enough to be able to make plays when it mattered. The Las Vegas Raiders offensive line, very boomer bust last year. They had the worst ground game of any team in the NFL, 3.6 yards per carry. Part of that was run blocking issues. Part of that was not having any competent running back as a starting and viable option on the field. In pass blocking scenarios, they were a lot better at times, but still, with Aidan O'Connell, who was immobile, really it allowed defenses to key in and defend the Raiders, who didn't have any threat of a ground game in a very different way. And so I think Geno Smith automatically going into that takes a bit of relief off the offensive line, allows the Raiders to approach things a lot differently. And I do wonder if the reuniting with Pete Carroll allows a level of comfort at this point of time to allow Geno to become just a little bit more of a designed and planned runner with Chip Kelly running the offense. I think Geno Smith is an incredibly underrated scrambler and runner of the football when he is allowed to do so. Perhaps that is an element that the Raiders are willing to take on and willing to take chances with. I listened to the entire Pete Carroll interview where he was talking about how the year off allowed him to go to different games and watch from a different perspective without having the pressure of prepping and game planning and keeping up with things every single week. And it allowed him to see football in a different way. And it reminded me a bit of the Mike McCarthy stuff from Dallas, where he went through this analytics revolution and he saw the light and everything was going to be better, and none of it ever came to fruition on the field. Hearing Pete explain what happened, I genuinely believe that he is going to approach things from a different manner. I think it's going to be different. I think it's going to look different. I think it's going to matter what he's saying, and I think it's going to have an impact on the field. I want to hate everything about what the Raiders are doing. I just don't know if I can. I actually like the way that Pete is talking about the year off and coming back and how he's going to approach this team. I like that Chip Kelly failed miserably as a head coach a decade ago in the NFL, went back to college, went away from his up-tempo system and started using some of these systems at Ohio State that are going to be so good that we're seeing other coaches adopt in the NFL to take on how so many teams are playing these nickel-based spread defenses. I like that Geno Smith is a fit with what the Raiders want to do and is a veteran quarterback that is in a resurgence part of his career that I think is better than everybody gives them credit for. And I like how John Spytek, the new GM, is talking about wanting to establish a physical identity on tape that is aggressive and shows up when teams are scouting them the week prior. Like, this is all a lot of coach speak, but I really believe it from the Raiders. And so as much as I want to hate this team, I don't know if I can. I mean, the defense last year was better than given credit for. And they signed Max Crosby, and Malcolm Kuntz comes back and could be a big boost in coverage, as well as, in rushing the passer. You're probably going to see a boost in coverage as well with some quiet additions that they added. I want to hate it, but I like the Raiders a little bit in the offseason here with the new coaching staff, with Geno Smith coming in. A big talking point that TA deserves a lot of credit for that he did not get, that was picked up by everywhere, was Geno Smith playing indoors compared to Geno Smith playing outdoors. It was mentioned here on the live stream last week in the podcast. And I said that I thought there was a lot of noise in the schedule of opponents that Geno Smith played indoors. That was, in fact, reality. More than half of the indoor starts for Geno Smith in Seattle were against bottom 10 defenses in terms of pass rush, in terms of yards per pass allowed. He only faced one defense that was in the top 10 for yards per pass allowed. He only faced 3 defenses that were in top 10 for pressure rate. And so not only was Geno in a lot of games indoors, which just became wide open shootouts, but Geno was also playing a lot of really bad defenses in those ideal environments. And quarterbacks playing indoors see their play elevated. Case in point, Sam Darnold last year. But that's just something that is league-wide for playing in controlled conditions. You get better quarterback play. And so Geno Smith excelled more than the average quarterback does. But getting 11 games this year indoors, I don't think it's as big of a deal as it's being made out to be. And I think we'll see those numbers kind of neutralize a little bit. But you can't ignore the fact that Geno Smith, as TA has pointed out, has exceeded that expectation of what happens when a quarterback goes indoors. So that's something here, certainly. And so, again, I want to hate this team. I kind of like everything that's going on with them. Last question before we get to questions coming in from the viewers is, which team has done the best job of surrounding their young quarterback with talent? So I can reference the Denver Broncos with Bo Nix. I can reference the Washington Commanders with what they did. They added Deebo Samuel, who I think is a good fit across from Terry McLaurin in an offense that throws so many screen passes. You can also reference Laramie Tunzel being added at left tackle, number 2 in pressures allowed the last 3 seasons of any left tackle league-wide. You can reference some of the defensive additions that the Commanders have made as well as bringing back Wagner and bringing back Ertz. They've done a lot to surround their second-year quarterback. See, I did it again with the Drake May thing. They've done a lot to surround him with talent. And so both of those are fair answers. But I think the one that stands out the most in free agency is the Chicago Bears and what they have added up front for Caleb Williams. Joe Thuney is the new left guard, top 10 at his position for years. Drew Dahlman is the new center, top 10 at his position for the last couple of years. Jonah Jackson is the new right guard, an upgrade for the Bears, a Pro Bowler a couple of seasons ago, has fell off a little bit the last 2 years, but certainly there's more upside than what the Bears had last year. And if he gets back to a Pro Bowl level, well, then you have arguably one of the best interior left guard, center, right guard offensive line combos of any team in the NFL in front of Caleb Williams, your second-year quarterback. So I think the Bears have to be the answer to this question of doing the best job surrounding their young quarterback with talent. This becomes an interesting discussion on what this is going to look like for the Bears in 2025. Last year, the Bears were 30th in runs inside the tackles. They had no ground game whatsoever running the ball between the tackles. Just by adding these 3 guys, you are going to elevate that level of run effectiveness between the tackles a considerable amount. Do the Bears become a top 10 running team between the tackles? Probably not, but it's going to be a lot better than 30th. And so just having some resemblance of a complementary ground game for Caleb Williams between the tackles, that's going to go a very long way to stabilizing this offense. I love the fact that Ben Johnson comes in as the new head coach and just immediately, right out of the gate, says, here's the vision. Let's go be aggressive in free agency. Let's get established veterans, and let's build the offensive line, the offensive front. I want this to be a quarterback-friendly system. I want us to control the line of scrimmage, and we need these guys to do it. And the Bears go out and boom, 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 get all 3 guys, problem solved. And he starts building. Like, you don't see coaches very often this quickly come in and be able to establish what vision they want based on what they have had a lot of success with the last couple of years, and then execute moves like this within the first 7 weeks of being the head coach of the team. And so I think that that is a very promising direction. I also believe that just by virtue of having these 3 guys on the offensive line, pass blocking is going to be elevated too, which is a good thing for a second-year quarterback. But where this gets very messy and where the impact of all of this might be felt most is going to be dependent on whether or not Ben Johnson can help coach out the habit of holding on to the ball for so long from Caleb Williams. I am not a big college football guy, but people who I trust who bet college football successfully, who analyze college football successfully at a very high level, have been kind of sharing a consensus that Caleb Williams, although he makes these big splash and flash throws, is at his best when he is getting the ball out on time, in rhythm, quickly. Now, last year, Caleb Williams held on to the ball for an eternity. The Bears' offensive line was just collectively viewed as being this terrible unit that couldn't hold up for any amount of time. The reality is a little bit different. The Bears' defense or offensive line last year was 16th in pass block win rate. They were 16th in aggregate pass block rankings. They were a lot better than I and everybody thought. The problem was that Caleb Williams had a pressure to sack rate of 12.4%. Now, to put that in context, the really bad quarterbacks in the league that hold on to the football for a really long time and take too many sacks are in the 5 to 7% range. I mean, Williams was more than double that. And this goes a bit to the Greg Cassell sort of theory that he had on the Ross Tucker podcast that's become very popular. And Greg was saying that when quarterbacks have this habit of holding on to the ball for a really long time in college, it's very hard to break them from that habit at the pro level. And quarterbacks that did that tend to carry it over to the pro level and just will always take on more sacks than they should because it's just in what they do as a QB. And so my question with the upgraded interior of the offensive line is, will the combination of better pass protection that perhaps could lead to a heightened level of comfort for Williams, better offensive scheming, getting guys open more frequently and quicker from Ben Johnson, and then just the experience and the coaching that Ben Johnson has as an OC and this new staff that's in Chicago has at the quarterback position, does that all combine to getting Caleb Williams releasing the football from his hand quicker, which in turn elevates this offense to a new height? I think that's the big question rather than will these three guys just play really well. I think the answer to that we already know, and it's yes. I just wonder is this all going to lead to Williams getting the ball out of his hands quicker? If it does, you have to be very excited about what the Bears offense could be this coming season because they've got pass catching weapons. I think this is a monster year ahead for Rome Odunze. I think he's going to be a guy that if you're a fantasy player, you're overpaying for. If you're a season-long prop guy, you're taking any over you can get. I think you circle Rome Odunze as just having a monster breakout season. There's a ton of weapons here for the Bears, and they may still add in the draft if they don't bolster the offensive line further, which wouldn't be a surprise to me at this point. I think if Caleb Williams can get the ball out of his hand quicker, there's a lot of potential here. Now, to quickly throw cold water on all of this, the Bears play the second most difficult schedule of projected opponents by point spread ratings currently. Their schedule is hellacious from start to finish. The average opponent that they play this coming season is currently rated 1.2 points better than an average football team. The road schedule that the Bears play this season, the average opponent is 2.67 points better than an average football team in the NFL. That is the second most difficult mark as well. I mean, there are no opportunities to take a breath for the Bears anywhere on this schedule. The one road game where the Bears could have been favored was against the Las Vegas Raiders. Now Geno Smith is the quarterback and pieces being added. Change that. I encourage everybody to go before you're tempted to make a Bears win total bet over a Bears future ticket, division, conference, whatever you want to do. If you're buying into Ben Johnson, you're buying into the hype, you're saying, this is my team, I want them over. I just encourage you, go look at the schedule of opponents before you do that, because you will be thinking twice after you do that. With these 3 moves on the offensive line, plus Ben Johnson, upgraded the Bears 3.5 points in their overall power rating, which is too much. It's too high. They're still projected to win less than 8 games from the Sims for the season because their schedule is so brutal. And so they may never realize their ultimate potential here because they're just playing brutal opponent after opponent after opponent every single week all season. And that might be the downfall of this team, regardless of how great the offensive line might be. Let's get to some questions here that come in. Moonfish is back for another show. Good to see you, Moonfish. Hopefully you're doing well. Ravens fan is asking, how will Hopkins fit in with the Ravens offense? Sorry if redundant, just tuned in. You're not redundant. Haven't been asked about it. Haven't thought about it a ton, honestly, Moonfish. He was basically a non-factor for the entire season for the Chiefs last year. Thinking about that offense and the direction it could go, I like the potential there, but I don't know how much he has left over the course of the year. I mean, the Ravens seldom went to depth at the receiver position last year. I wonder if that changes a little bit with some of the shifting going on at the tight end spot for them. And so potentially there could be an intriguing fit. They sure got a lot out of Derrick Henry when similar questions were posed around him last year, but Hopkins, obviously a few more years older, and I just wonder how much is left there for them. I want to like any person like Hopkins going into the Ravens offense, but the reality is they just haven't got a lot out of these veteran guys that are in the depth spot at receiver all that much in the Lamar Jackson era, off the top of my head. Big Ross says, money always talks, but if I'm Cup with that injury history, I'm not exactly excited to practice outside of New England. He's been very vocal about that too, Big Ross. You're right. He doesn't like the outside cold weather games. He doesn't like the indoor turf and what that does to his joints and his body. I would think if there was a landing spot for him, it's a warm weather team outdoors on a natural surface. I don't know if he has the luxury of being able to pick like that after being released from the Rams, basically being kind of telegraphed to the world that the Rams think there's something seriously wrong there. And so that makes it, I think, maybe tough for him to pick and choose. But I agree with you for sure. Ryan Roberts says, what about the flip? Total Steele signing. I wonder what that was about specifically. If you want to clarify that question, I would like to have it. Helms, I don't have an opinion on that Raiders signing specifically. Slay the Beast says Hopkins for 1,000 yards if he can play a full season. Again, I think that's a lofty expectation. And he's also confirming that, hey, tough division for the Bears, not a chance. You putting that lightly. What do you think about the Vikings, Lions, and how they have progressed this offseason? And then, I mean, it's just every single game all year long is just brutal. The Packers are being the kind of sneaky Super Bowl pick I'm seeing a lot on my timeline in what they could turn into. I think there was some disappointment. They weren't able to land a true number one in free agency. A lot of discussion and speculation about potentially getting DK Metcalf, which never came to fruition. So, I mean, it's just every game for the Bears, even out of the division, is just brutal so far. Dev is asking, anyone in the chat have any season win total leans? Good question. What would I lean on with a win total? I'm going to pull up the FanDuel win totals and just see one that is sitting at the top of my mind. They don't have them up. Nobody has them up. I'm getting overexcited there. Nobody's got win totals up yet. I looked. If you see a book that has them, I haven't seen them honestly posted anywhere. Now that I think about it, I'll say this: the Niners are a team that I'll certainly be looking at because I think we get a very deflated win total from them when we see these posted. I'll be curious to see how their schedule falls. They have the easiest schedule of any team based on point spread ratings that I'm looking at right now. They are projected to win over 10 games, even with some of these departures and the team being downgraded. I saw that their futures odds pre-free agency and now like post what moves have already happened have not changed that much at sports books that matter. I know there's a lot of VIG that goes into those Super Bowl markets, but I think the sentiment that I'm seeing the 49ers talked about as we got to in question number 2, the sentiment I'm seeing does not match the reflection in the market so far. And so I'm wondering if once we get to win totals and that's set a little bit differently, do we see that depressed a little bit? They're the inverse of the Bears. Go look at the 49ers schedule. I mean, they have layup after layup after layup. If they get Warren at 12, that certainly excites me quite a bit about what that offense can do. And so that would be a team that I signal out. Maybe we see them at 9.5. That would be exciting to me to go over if that becomes an option. Let me know, guys, in the chat before we wrap up, just under an hour here, any more questions that you have about free agency, other topics that I haven't touched on that we'll probably obviously get to in upcoming live streams and podcasts over the next couple of weeks. DK Metcalf going to Pittsburgh. I thought that was a really unusual fit, but I want to reserve full judgment there until I know who the quarterback is going to be. I think between Wilson and Rodgers, if you're going to ask me which one makes more sense for getting the most out of DK Metcalf, if George Pickens stays, I would say it's Russell Wilson with his deep ball willingness down the sidelines. Now, Nate Tice today had a post about Aaron Rodgers last year and the effectiveness of the go balls that he was throwing downfield. DK Metcalf, no surprise, benefited a ton last year on go routes. I get that connection is going to become popular and is going to be made, and there's going to be fallout and saying, hey, Aaron Rodgers last year, best season since 2021, played through injuries, coming off the injury, was way better than expected. So much of the season-long numbers for Aaron Rodgers were garbage time inflated. The Jets led into the fourth quarter, just 7 games last year. 4 of them were by 2 points or less. Devontae Adams had more than half of his receiving yards for the season in the final 5 weeks. The Jets were constantly playing catch-up. Outside of the Pats game and the Texans game, off the top of my head, like those were the only 2 games where the Jets built leads early because of Aaron Rodgers throwing the football. Otherwise, it was Aaron Rodgers putting up numbers, playing catch-up and in garbage time. And so I think his season-long numbers were really misleading. And if I'm thinking about like DK Metcalf, fiery competitor on the field that's very stubborn. George Pickens, fiery competitor on the field that's very stubborn. Aaron Rodgers, fiery competitor on the field that's very stubborn. How is that going to work when Aaron Rodgers is visibly like he was every other snap for the Jets, with just the worst facial expressions you'll ever see from a quarterback, cussing out wide receivers? Nobody's going to convince me that Pickens and Metcalf are just going to go with that and be okay with it. And Rodgers is just going to adapt to this scheme where he's asked to drop back further, hold on to the ball longer, and take those deep shots. Last year, Rodgers was 3rd lowest for intended air yards per pass. Aaron Rodgers last year was 4th quickest to release the football. And so, like, I see these tweets coming out today about the effectiveness of the go balls and how he was able to throw the ball well downfield. There's a lot of buts to that I think about what the Steelers did last year. 2nd most deep passes downfield attempted. They were 2nd only to Philadelphia. The Steelers are trying to replicate the Eagles' offense is what they're trying to do. You think about the Eagles, it's A.J. Brown on one side, Devontae Smith on the other. Teams have to decide what they're going to do. Are you going to try man up and allocate more resources outside? Well, if you do, Saquon Barkley is going to hit you for a big run. If you don't, well, Jalen Hurts is going to hit on those deep passes down the sideline. That was the Steelers' offense at its best last year with Russ. He just only had one option to throw to, and it was just contested ball after contested ball after contested ball. I don't think that's Aaron Rodgers' game stepping in here. And so I would think that Wilson's the better fit than Rodgers for Pittsburgh. But I don't know how Metcalf necessarily fits in this offense. I know the Steelers' futures odds have dropped more than any other team percentage-wise, or you can say increased, if you will. Had a better chance to win the Super Bowl now. They've improved more than any other team in the NFL. I don't know. I'll wait and see a little bit to see what kind of QB we get. But certainly some of that price increases because of the speculation that Rodgers might go there. Other teams I didn't touch on, I don't need to get into the Jets with Fields. That's a reach for a bridge quarterback at best. I watched Breece Hall and Braylon Allen get blown up half a second after getting the handoff in the backfield 4 to 5 yards deep every single game last year, multiple times. It felt like now you're going to put Justin Fields in there, who teams league-wide do not respect as a legitimate downfield passing quarterback. They're going to key in on the run. The Jets have done very little to improve the offensive line. Like, I'm just expected that things are going to get better. I don't know if I buy into that. And so the upside with Justin Fields sure isn't high. The Jets are not, in my opinion, in line to be competitive for the division. I would hope that Aaron Glenn gets a lot more out of that defense. But I'll tell you, if you're relying on Brandon Stevens, brought in the free agency window, to put in significant time opposite Sauce Gardner, who really declined last year, and you're just expecting Stevens, who was picked on week after week after week for the Ravens, to be the answer in place of DJ Reed, who left, that seems like a really big ask. And so to me, this is the Jets, I don't want to say actively tanking because I don't buy into that, but next year's quarterback class is stacked. And if it's a new staff looking to get their guy next year, you're probably looking at a ceiling of 7 wins with Justin Fields, in my opinion, in that team. Carolina made some signings on defense, more to come. J.C. Horn signing was great. Wharton, I thought Bill Barnwell in his article this week referenced it really well. He had good sack numbers for Kansas City, but he was the number 2 man in on almost all of those sacks. Very misleading numbers. Brown was let go by the Rams, who quickly ended up replacing him with Poona Ford. I think that's pretty telling on what Brown is as a nose tackle. Jones was the best signing of the trio, but none of those are big needle movers for me outside of Horn, who I thought was a good signing by the Carolina Panthers. Other moves, or lack thereof, I mean, my biggest botching free agency so far candidate is the Cincinnati Bengals for not getting a deal done with T. Higgins and not getting a deal done with Jamar Chase yet. They've made promises to make Chase the highest paid non-QB in the league. They could have done that 2 years ago for 20-something million. I know that hindsight's always perfect, but you knew you had to sign him a couple weeks ago before Max Crosby was signed, before Myles Garrett was signed, and now you're going to have to pay a lot more for it. And so I think they deserve a ton of criticism for how they've handled it. The fact that the Bengals, for the 5 years that Joe Burrow has been the quarterback, have not had an uninterrupted offseason, whether it be Burrow injuries, last year with holdouts and contract disputes. Like, this can't go on forever. The Bengals in the first 3 weeks of the season with Joe Burrow, who's played those games, are 4-10-1. Every single year, the Bengals are playing catch up. Why, as an organization, are you wanting to put this team possibly back in that scenario again? Just get the deals done. Like, this can't go on forever. And they're just content letting it sit there. I don't understand it. And now they're going to have to pay dearly for it, if they're able to do it at all. I don't know. And so if you're a Bengals fan, you have to be just frustrated as hell for how they've handled that. Completely botching free agency so far, not getting those deals done. Last one I'll touch on here. Houston added Christian Kirk. I think that's obviously not a big headline maker, but very kind of intriguing from potentially how teams are going to have to defend the Houston Texans. Nico Collins is elite against zone. He was very good against man, to be fair, as well. He's just a great wide receiver. But the Texans, for a while now, have been looking for that great, effective route runner across from Nico Collins who can put in significant snaps and really beat man coverage on his own. They were hoping that was Stephon Diggs last year. They've obviously been wanting Tank Dell to be that guy, but now you're not going to have Diggs in all likelihood, who's going to be moved on from. And I don't think Dell is going to play this entire season at all. I think adding Christian Kirk was very good. Kirk is one of the best route runners in the NFL. He's incredibly effective at beating man coverage. He's very good out of the slot. I think he's a really nice number 2 for the Houston Texans and is going to change how teams have to defend them. And so prop market-wise, matchup-wise, week by week, that's going to be definitely a guy to circle. As we know, Collins against zone, You're playing his overs, Kirk against Mann when the Texans line up again. You're going to be playing his overs because that was the case with Jacksonville in those matchups last season too. And so I think that's a sneaky good signing there by the Houston Texans. Okay, that'll do it for me. I hope everybody has a fantastic rest of the week. Thanks for tuning in for the free agency live stream. I hope everybody is enjoying the offseason that never sleeps with all the news coming in and all the changes and all the team adjustments and storylines that come from it. The NFL is the best sport in the world for a reason, and we're seeing it on full display here in the middle of March. Thanks again, everybody. We'll chat to you soon on the next episode.